He owned thousands of acres, hundreds of cattle, and more money than most men in the territory would see in 3 lifetimes. Nathaniel Cross had built an empire from nothing and lost the only thing that ever mattered. Then a silent woman with a broken past arrived at his gate in a snowstorm, and he made the mistake of letting her in. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't explain herself. She just worked and waited, and slowly made his empty fortress feel like a home. But the man who owned her past wasn't finished with her. And when he came with legal papers and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, Nathaniel discovered that all his wealth couldn't protect the one person he'd finally allowed himself to care about. What happens when the richest man on the frontier decides that some fights are worth losing everything for? Stay until the end, because the answer will cost more than you expect. If this story moves you, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. The snow started falling before dark, which meant it would be bad by midnight. Nathaniel Cross stood at the window of his study and watched the first flakes come down sideways, driven hard by a wind that had been building since noon. He knew this kind of storm. He'd grown up in it, lost cattle to it, buried a hand or two who'd gotten caught out in it without shelter. The mountain winters out here didn't negotiate. They arrived, they took what they wanted, and they left when they were finished. He turned from the window and went back to his desk. The ledger in front of him showed what it always showed. Numbers that should have made him feel something and didn't. The Cross Ranch had turned its best profit in 6 years this past season. 412 head of cattle sold at Cheyenne. 3 contracts signed with the railroad. A new bunkhouse finished before the cold came in. By any measure a man in this territory used to judge himself, Nathaniel Cross was doing extraordinarily well. He closed the ledger without marking his place. The study was warm, lit by 2 oil lamps and a fire that his housekeeper Margaret had built up before she retired to the servants' quarters for the evening. The room smelled of pine wood and old leather, and the particular smell of a house that had been cleaned recently but not lived in for some time. Nathaniel had books on the shelves he hadn't opened in 3 years. He had a chair by the fire he never sat in. He had a portrait on the wall of himself at 32, painted by an artist passing through Laramie, and sometimes he looked at it and didn't recognize the man looking back at him. He was 38 now. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey and didn't drink it. He stood in the center of the room, listening to the wind work at the eaves, and he thought about absolutely nothing, which was the skill he had perfected above all others in the past 4 years. Then he heard the bell at the gate. His foreman, a Texan named Russ Decker, found him in the hallway pulling on his coat. "I'll go," Russ said. He was a broad man, 45 years old, with hands like shovels, and a way of speaking that wasted nothing. "Storm's getting mean out there. I heard the bell. Could be travelers off the mountain road, could be trouble." "Could be both," Nathaniel said, and pulled on his hat. They walked out together into a cold that bit at the ears immediately. The snow was coming in sheets now, and the torches along the fence line guttered and threw moving shadows across the yard. 2 of the hands were already at the gate, holding lanterns, and when Nathaniel got close enough to see what was waiting on the other side, he stopped walking. A man on horseback, old, or at least worn enough to look old, in a coat that wasn't adequate for the weather. And beside him, on a horse that looked half dead with exhaustion, a woman. She sat upright in the saddle in a way that seemed like it cost her something. Her coat was dark and plain and too thin for the night, and her face was turned slightly away from the wind, and even in the poor light Nathaniel could see that she wasn't dressed for any kind of traveling in these conditions. She was dressed like someone who had left somewhere in a hurry and grabbed whatever was nearest. "Open the gate," Nathaniel said. Russ hesitated half a second, which was his way of registering an opinion he knew better than to state, and then he nodded at the hands and the gate swung inward. The old man dismounted with the careful stiffness of bad joints and too many miles, and he led his horse inside while the woman remained mounted. Up close, Nathaniel could see the man had white hair gone nearly yellow at the temples, and eyes that held the particular clarity of someone who had been cold for a long time and was choosing not to show it. "Name's Harlan Price," the old man said. He didn't extend his hand either because of the cold or because he was reading Nathaniel's face and deciding against it. "I'm a preacher out of Casper. This is Evelyn Hart. We've been on the mountain road since this morning, and I need to ask for shelter for the night. Both of us." Nathaniel looked at the woman. she was looking at the house. Not at him, at the house. As if she was calculating something about it, or as if the sight of something solid and warm required a moment to take in. Her face was still, not frightened, not hopeful, just very carefully composed in the way of someone who had learned to keep their expressions from giving anything away. "Get off the horse," Nathaniel said to her. She looked at him then. Her eyes were dark, and they were direct, and there was something in them that he couldn't name in the second or two before she looked away again. She dismounted without help, landed in the snow, and pulled her coat tighter around herself with a movement that was precise and unsentimental, like a person managing a problem. "Where are you headed?" Nathaniel asked the preacher. "East. Medicine Bow, eventually." Price was pulling off his gloves, already looking toward the house with a gratitude he was trying to moderate into dignity. "We were caught by the weather. I wasn't expecting it to turn this fast." "Nobody ever is." Nathaniel looked at the woman again. "What about her?" Price glanced at Evelyn. Something moved across his face that Nathaniel couldn't read. "Miss Hart needs a place to stay through the winter. She has no family and no home to return to. I've been attempting to find her a suitable situation." He paused. "I was told you sometimes take on household help." "Who told you that?" "A man in Elk Creek." "I don't know what man in Elk Creek told you anything about my household," Nathaniel said, "but he didn't have my permission to do it." Price met his eyes and didn't look away. "I understand that, and I'm not here to press you. I'm asking. There's a difference." The snow came down between them. Nathaniel looked at the woman again. She hadn't spoken. She was standing in the snow with her arms slightly crossed against the cold, and she was looking at a point somewhere past his shoulder, and whatever she was thinking about it was entirely private. She didn't look like someone who was hoping for something. She looked like someone who had stopped hoping for things and was simply waiting to find out what happened next. "Margaret will put you both in the guest rooms for the night," Nathaniel said. "We'll talk in the morning." That's it. He didn't sleep well. He rarely did, and he'd stopped being bothered by it. He lay in the dark and listened to the storm throw itself against the house. And he thought about the woman standing in the snow, about the particular stillness of her, about the way her eyes had been direct for exactly 1 second before she looked away. He got up at 5 and dressed in the dark and went down to the kitchen where Margaret was already starting the stove. Margaret Albright had worked for him for 11 years, since before his wife died, and she was one of 2 or 3 people in the world who didn't alter their behavior in his presence in ways that irritated him. "The preacher snores," she said without turning around. "The woman doesn't make a sound." "Did you speak to her?" "I tried." She nodded. "She seems to understand everything. She just doesn't—" Margaret paused, choosing her words with the care she always used. "She doesn't speak, not that I heard." Nathaniel poured himself coffee. "At all. At all. Could be she can't. Could be she won't. Couldn't tell you which." He stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and watched the snow. The storm had done what storms like that always did, blown itself out overnight and left the world white and still and very quiet. The mountains in the distance were invisible behind low cloud. The yard was 3 inches deep at least. "She can stay," he said. Margaret turned then and looked at him. "Until spring," he said. "After that, we'll see." "Mr. Cross, she can help you with the house, whatever she's able to do." He finished his coffee. "Tell the preacher he can get back on the road today if the weather holds, and tell him I said thank you." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "You're a complicated man," she said finally. "People keep telling me that," he said, and went to find Russ. Harlan Price left after breakfast. He found Nathaniel in the yard and shook his hand and said, "She's been through a great deal, Mr. Cross. More than most people would survive. I'd ask you to keep that in mind." Then he looked at Nathaniel the way preachers looked at men they weren't sure about, and he got on his horse and rode east into the white. Evelyn watched him go from the front steps of the house. She stood there after his horse disappeared over the ridge, very still, and Nathaniel watched her from the fence line, and then she turned and went back inside without looking at him. Russ appeared at Nathaniel's elbow. "You sure about this?" "No." Russ nodded like that was a reasonable answer and walked off toward the barn. The first 2 weeks were strange. Evelyn moved through the house like water finding its level, quietly, efficiently, without announcement. She helped Margaret in the kitchen without being asked, learning the routine by watching and then simply joining it. She cleaned rooms that hadn't been touched in 2 years. She reorganized the pantry in a way that made everything findable, which Margaret declared to be a small miracle. She did all of this without a word. She had a way of communicating that wasn't exactly sign language, but was something close. Precise gestures, pointed looks, the careful use of her face to carry information that other people used words for. Margaret adapted to it faster than Nathaniel would have expected. He could hear the two of them in the kitchen sometimes, Margaret talking in her ordinary way and Evelyn responding in her silence, and the conversation seemed to work. He stayed out of her way. He told himself it was because he didn't want to make her uncomfortable, and that was part of it. But it was also because something about the way she occupied his house was disrupting his habits in ways he hadn't anticipated, and he needed time to work out what to make of it. She was always doing something. That was the first thing. He was accustomed to a house where people moved from task to task in a kind of exhausted routine, and where things that needed doing often sat undone for weeks because nobody had the energy. Evelyn looked at a problem and solved it, without drama, without waiting to be asked. The loose board on the back step that had been loose for 2 winters got a nail in it on her 3rd day there. The storage shed that had developed a small leak got a piece of oilcloth tacked over it on her 5th day. She did these things with tools from the barn without speaking to anyone about it, and the only evidence was that the problem was no longer a problem. "Where did she learn to do that?" Nathaniel asked Margaret. "I have no idea," Margaret said, "but she does know what she's doing." The second thing he noticed was the animals. The Cross Ranch had a dog, an old cattle hound named Cap, who had belonged to one of the hands who died of fever 2 summers back, and had been drifting around the property ever since, tolerated but not particularly tended to. Within a week of Evelyn's arrival, Cap was sleeping at the foot of her bed. Within 2 weeks, he followed her everywhere she went in the house, and his ribs were less visible. She also spent time in the barn with the horses. Nathaniel found this out because Russ mentioned it, puzzled, one evening. "She's been out there with the bay gelding," Russ said, "the one with the leg problem. I didn't say anything because she wasn't causing trouble, but I thought you should know." "What's she doing with him?" "Mostly just sitting near him. Sometimes she puts her hand on the leg. I looked at it yesterday, and I think it's actually better." Russ said this last part like he was reporting something he'd decided to take at face value rather than waste time doubting. Nathaniel went to the barn himself that evening, late enough that he didn't expect to find her still there. But she was. She was sitting on a hay bale next to the gelding stall, with a lantern beside her, and she had one hand on the horse's neck, and the horse was standing with his head down in a posture of absolute calm. She heard him come in and looked up. They looked at each other for a moment. "I'm not stopping you," he said, which wasn't what he'd meant to say, but it was accurate. She held his gaze for 2 or 3 seconds, that same direct look she'd given him in the snow, brief and clear, and then she looked back at the horse. He stayed longer than he'd intended. He sat on the other side of the stall and watched her with the gelding, and he didn't talk, and she didn't either, and it wasn't uncomfortable, which was the thing that surprised him most. He found out more about her by accident than design. He wasn't in the habit of asking people about themselves. He'd spent 4 years cultivating a manner that discouraged that kind of exchange, and most people respected it because most people were relieved not to have to offer the same in return. But he found himself noticing things, and the things he noticed told him a story he couldn't quite complete. Her hands. She was careful with them, deliberate, precise, but they had marks on them that didn't come from light housework. Calluses in places that suggested heavy labor. A scar along the back of her right hand, old and faded, that curved in a shape that looked like a burn. Her reactions to certain sounds. A door slammed in the wind once while she was in the kitchen with Margaret, and Nathaniel happened to be passing and saw how her whole body locked for half a second before she caught herself. She recovered so quickly that someone not paying attention wouldn't have seen it, but he'd been paying attention. The way she ate. She ate everything that was put in front of her, completely, without waste, in the quick, focused way of someone who had spent time being uncertain about the next meal. He put these things together, and then he put them away, because it wasn't his business, and because whatever had happened to her was hers to carry, or not as she chose. But knowing it changed something in how he moved around her. He became careful in ways he hadn't been in a long time. He didn't come up behind her suddenly. He knocked before entering rooms he might find her in. He told Russ to tell the hands the same, and to keep some of the louder ones out of the house. Russ looked at him for a moment. "You're going to a lot of trouble," he said. "I'm running a household," Nathaniel said. Russ accepted this without comment, which was the thing about Russ that made him indispensable. The storm that trapped them together in the third week of December started as snow and became something worse. It came in the night, and by morning it was a full blizzard, the kind that made the barn invisible from the back door. 3 of the hands were already out on the range, and Russ took the 4th and went after them, leaving Nathaniel to manage the house and whatever might need managing there. The temperature dropped so fast that the water in the outside trough turned to solid ice in under 2 hours. They spent 3 days snowbound. Nathaniel, Margaret, Evelyn, and an injured hand named Pete who'd twisted his knee badly a week before and was still walking with a cane. The first day was fine. There was enough to do, wood to bring in, pipes to keep from freezing, the livestock in the barn to tend to. Nathaniel worked alongside Evelyn carrying split wood from the woodpile to the house, and she matched his pace without complaint, carrying more than he would have asked her to carry and doing it without any particular effort to look like she was doing it. "You don't have to tss," he started. She gave him a look that was so plainly impatient that he stopped talking and went back to carrying wood. The second day was harder. They were confined to the house, the snow too heavy and the wind too dangerous to go far, and the 4 of them moved around each other in the particular way of people who aren't used to being enclosed together. Pete talked a great deal, out of boredom or pain or both, and Margaret answered him and kept him company. Nathaniel read, or tried to. Evelyn found things to do with a resourcefulness that was almost stubborn. She mended things, sorted things, fixed a broken chair leg with tools she'd apparently carried in from the barn before the storm got bad enough to prevent it. The third day, the wind dropped enough that Nathaniel could see across the yard, and he went out to check on the cattle in the barn and found Evelyn already there. She had gotten there through the snow without telling anyone, which was exactly the kind of thing he wanted to say something about and found he couldn't because there was no good argument against it. She'd broken a trail with a shovel she'd taken from beside the back door, and she was moving through the barn with a calm efficiency that told him she'd done something like this before, checking each animal, filling water, moving hay. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. "You've worked with livestock before," he said. She didn't look up. She moved from the gelding stall to the next one over and kept working. "I'm not asking you to talk about it," he said. "I'm just saying, you know what you're doing." She glanced at him over her shoulder. Not the brief direct look, something a bit longer this time, a little less guarded. Then she turned back to the horse. He went to work in the barn alongside her, and they stayed out there for 2 hours in the cold, working beside each other, and the only sounds were the horses and the wind outside and the scratch of tools on frozen hay, and he found himself thinking about nothing at all, which was the opposite of his usual nothing, not the blank purposeful emptiness he'd constructed over 4 years, but something that felt more like quiet. He noticed it was different and filed that observation somewhere and did not look at it directly. It was Margaret who finally told him what little she knew on the 4th morning after the blizzard had broken and the hands had come back in from the range, cold and tired and irritable. She came to the study and closed the door behind her, which was unusual enough that Nathaniel put down his pen. "I had a conversation with her this morning," Margaret said. "She wrote some things down." She produced a piece of paper from her apron pocket and set it on the desk. The writing was careful and precise, each letter formed deliberately, as if she was someone who had not always been able to write and had learned it with effort. "I worked for a man named Ridley in Wyoming. He said I owed him money for my father's debts. I worked for 3 years, and the debt never got smaller. I left when I could, and Preacher Price found me on the road. That was all." Nathaniel read it twice, then he folded the paper and held it. "She wanted you to know?" he asked. "She wanted to know if it was going to be a problem," Margaret said. "Whether you'd want her to go. She said she'd understand if you did." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, his hands were moving through the yard, the snow already trodden to mud in the high-traffic areas, the barn doors open. Ordinary life resuming. "Tell her it's not a problem," he said. Margaret nodded once and went to the door. "And tell her—" He stopped. Margaret waited. "Tell her she doesn't owe me anything either," he said. "Tell her that up front." Margaret looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. Yes, Mr. Cross, she said, and left. Post. He brought the gelding inside to the smaller barn on a Tuesday afternoon in early January, when the temperature dropped enough to worry about the leg. Evelyn was with him without his asking, because she'd seen him heading out and had put on her coat and followed, and he'd stopped pretending to find this surprising. They worked together to move the horse, which required patience and took longer than it would have with someone talking. But he discovered that working with Evelyn required a different kind of attention. You watched her instead of listening, and she watched back, and information moved between them in a way that was slower and less efficient than speech, and he had started to think more accurate. She pointed at the horse's leg and then made a motion with her hand that he'd learned meant look. He looked. The swelling was down more than he'd expected. "You've been treating it," he said, "not just sitting with him." She made a small movement with one hand that he was starting to read as a kind of shrug, not dismissive, more like yes, obviously. "What are you using?" She went to the corner of the barn where she'd apparently organized a small section of supplies without mentioning it, and she brought back a jar of something that smelled of pine and something he didn't recognize. "Margaret's?" She shook her head. "You made it." A nod. He turned the jar in his hands. "Where did you learn that?" She held out her hand for the jar, and he gave it back to her, and that was the end of that conversation. But he noticed that night, eating dinner in the dining room alone as he always did, that his mind kept returning not to the gelding or the winter or the contracts waiting on his desk, but to the specific way she had held out her hand, a gesture so matter-of-fact, so unbothered, that it told him without words that she had made peace with the limits of what she would explain and didn't feel she needed to justify them. He'd spent 4 years being closed off from other people and telling himself it was a choice he'd made from strength. He was beginning to suspect she knew something about it that he didn't. Itats. January deepened and the cold settled in the way it did in the mountains, not dramatic anymore but constant, a fact of life that shaped every decision about when to go outside and for how long and what to do when you got back in. The ranch operated on a winter rhythm that Nathaniel had lived for years, slow, deliberate, internally focused. He started eating dinner in the kitchen. He told himself it was more practical. The dining room was at the far end of the house and cost more to heat. Margaret raised her eyebrow exactly 1/4 of an inch and said nothing. Evelyn, when he came in the first evening and sat down at the kitchen table with his plate, glanced at him once and went back to her food. Pete, whose knee was healing, talked enough for all of them. But on the evenings Pete turned in early, the 3 of them, Nathaniel, Margaret, Evelyn, sat in the kitchen, and the silence was of a different quality than the silences Nathaniel was used to. It had something in it. He couldn't name what. He started noticing when she was in the room and when she wasn't. He started noticing when she was tired. She got a particular stillness about the eyes. And when something had bothered her during the day, which showed in a subtle tightening around the shoulders that disappeared when she saw him looking. He started noticing what she noticed, the places in the house that needed work, the animals that weren't quite right, the moments in a conversation, he and Russ, he and Margaret, when something meaningful was said. She listened to everything. He had the impression that she had spent so long being unable to speak that she had redirected that energy entirely into watching and understanding, and that she probably knew more about what was actually happening on the Cross Ranch than most of the people who worked there. He found himself wanting to know what she thought about things. This was new enough that he turned it over carefully, looking at it from different angles, deciding what to do about it. It had been a very long time since he'd wanted to know what another person thought. He'd trained himself out of it, gradually, after his wife died. The wanting of things from people, the expecting of things, the particular vulnerability of caring about someone's opinion of a situation. He'd learned to move through his life without that exposure, and he'd told himself he preferred it. He was less certain of that now. She found him in the study one evening in late January when he'd left the door open. He'd left the door open because the fire was going well and the heat moved into the hallway better that way. That was the practical reason. He wasn't thinking about anything else when she appeared in the doorway and then stood there. "Come in if you want," he said. She came in and looked at the bookshelves. He watched her look at them. She moved along the shelves slowly, her eyes going from title to title. and he watched her face and tried to read what it said. Curiosity, clearly. And something else, a kind of hunger, maybe, though that word felt too dramatic, more like the expression of someone who was recognizing something they'd been separated from. "You can borrow anything you like," he said. She pulled out a book and looked at the cover and then looked at him. It was a collection of surveying journals from the 1850s, which was not what he would have predicted. "That's not—" He stopped. "It's yours if you want it. It's probably dull." She opened it to the middle and read a page and a half while he watched, and then she closed it and held it against her chest and looked at him with an expression that, for once, she didn't guard. It was the most undefended look she'd given him since she arrived. He looked back at her and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't be less than what the moment was. She took the book and went upstairs. He sat in the study for a long time after, listening to the fire and the wind outside and the sound of his own heartbeat, which was doing something he hadn't paid attention to in a long time. He thought about a woman who had been made to work 3 years for a debt she didn't owe, who had walked out of that situation and been found by a stranger on a road in the middle of nowhere, who had come to his house with nothing except what she could carry and the knowledge of how to survive in it, and had made herself indispensable in 3 weeks without asking for anything, without expecting anything, without performing gratitude or smallness or any of the things a person in her position might have been expected to perform. He thought about the way she had looked at his bookshelf. He thought about the surveying journals, and why those, and what that said about where her mind went when nobody was directing it. He picked up his pen and tried to go back to his ledger, and couldn't, and sat there for a while longer with the pen in his hand and the numbers in front of him, and a feeling in his chest that he recognized only because he'd spent 4 years working to get rid of it. Outside, the wind pushed snow against the glass, and the fire snapped, and somewhere upstairs in the room he'd given her, Evelyn Hart was reading about the surveying of unknown territory by men who had no maps, only compasses, moving through land that nobody had named yet. He thought that was probably not an accident. He set the pen down and closed the ledger and turned to look at the fire, and for the first time in a very long time, the silence in his house felt like something other than what he'd chosen instead of grief. It felt, faintly and cautiously, and without his full permission, like the beginning of something else. He didn't mention the book. That was the decision he made sometime in the night, lying awake listening to the wind work itself out, and he held to it in the morning when he came down to the kitchen and found Evelyn already there, starting the stove with the same focused economy she brought to everything. The surveying journals were not on the kitchen table. He didn't know where she'd put them, and he didn't ask. Margaret came in behind him, took in the scene with the particular radar she'd developed over 11 years of working in his house, and started on breakfast without comment. It was an ordinary morning. That was the strange part. Russ came in from the barn with news about one of the older heifers who'd been off her feed, and Nathaniel put on his coat and went out with him to look. And they spent an hour in the cold working out what was wrong with her. And when they came back in for coffee, Evelyn had set 3 cups on the table, including one for Russ, without being asked. And Russ picked it up and drank it, and thanked her without making anything of it, and she nodded once and went back to whatever she was doing. Nathaniel watched this and said nothing. What he was thinking, though he wouldn't have put it in these words, was that she had made herself belong somewhere without asking whether she was allowed to. Not performing gratitude, not making herself small. Just present, necessary. As though she had looked at his household and found the shape of where she fit and moved into it, the way water finds level, the way a good hand finds the work that needs doing before you point at it. He'd hired men who couldn't do that after 10 years. February came in hard and stayed that way. The ranch settled into the deep winter rhythm that Nathaniel knew in his bones. Shorter days, longer dark, the work that could be done outside done fast, and the rest managed from within the house and barn. The hands played cards in the bunkhouse most evenings. Russ did his paperwork at the kitchen table. Margaret knitted things she never talked about knitting, and that appeared finished without ceremony. And Evelyn read. She read everything she could find. He discovered this gradually, the way you discover something that's been happening quietly for a while. The surveying journals went back to the shelf after a week, and something else came off. Then something else. She seemed to have no particular preference for subject. She moved from the surveys to a collection of agricultural studies he'd acquired years ago from a university man passing through, to a beaten copy of a natural history that had been on his shelves so long he couldn't remember acquiring it, to a slim volume on basic veterinary practice that he'd bought for Russ and that Russ had never opened. The veterinary book she read twice. He knew this because he found it on the kitchen table one morning with a piece of ribbon marking a page, and then 3 days later the ribbon had moved backward, which meant she'd gone back. He picked it up and looked at the page she'd been on, a chapter on bone and joint inflammation in horses. He thought about the gelding's leg and the jar of something that smelled like pine. He put the book back exactly where he'd found it. She got into an argument with Pete in the second week of February, which was notable because it was the first real disruption of the household's winter quiet, and because arguments with Evelyn, as it turned out, did not require her to speak a word. Pete was better. His knee had come around enough that he was moving without the cane. And better meant restless, and restless meant that the quality of his company had declined somewhat from his earlier, more grateful period. He'd taken to wandering into whatever room she was working in and making observations about the work that she didn't ask for. Nathaniel heard about it from Margaret first. She reorganized the tack room, Margaret said, in the tone she used when she was relaying information she considered significant. Pete told her she did it wrong, said he couldn't find anything. Can he find anything now? He hasn't tried to look for anything yet. He just told her it was wrong. Nathaniel went to find Pete, who was in the barn looking at the reorganized tack room with the expression of a man who was committed to a position he was less confident about than when he'd taken it. Evelyn was there too, standing about 6 feet away, not doing anything, just standing there with her arms folded and her eyes on Pete in a manner that Nathaniel could only describe as patient and absolutely merciless. Pete looked over his shoulder at Nathaniel and seemed relieved to have an audience of more than one. I told her I can't find anything in here, Pete said. She moved everything around and now... Where do you need to find something? Well, right now I need the... Pete looked at the wall and stopped. The bridles were organized by horse now, each one on its own hook with the horse's name written on a piece of paper above it, something Pete had not thought to do and which Nathaniel had also not thought to do in years of using this barn. The bay's bridle, he pointed at it. It was 6 inches from where he'd been looking. Nathaniel looked at Pete and then looked at Evelyn. She hadn't moved. Her expression said nothing, but what it said nothing about was very loud. Can you find it? Nathaniel asked Pete. Pete looked at the bridle, and then at Evelyn, and then at Nathaniel. That's not the point, he said, without any real conviction. What is the point? Pete didn't have an answer to that, and Nathaniel left them to it, and by supper Pete had apparently decided the tack room was probably an improvement because he mentioned at the kitchen table that he'd found the supply of spare stirrup leathers that had gone missing in October, which had turned out to be behind a box that had been in the wrong place the entire time. He said this to Margaret, not to Evelyn directly. Evelyn was eating and didn't look up. Nathaniel thought, watching this, that she had a very specific kind of patience, not the passive patience of someone waiting to be treated better, but the active patience of someone who'd already won and saw no need to announce it. The thing he couldn't shake, through all of February and into the first gray weeks of March, was the question of what she wanted, not what she needed. He'd worked that out well enough. Shelter, reasonable work, to be left alone about her past, and access to his bookshelves, apparently. What she needed was simple, and he could provide it and did. But wants were different. Wants were the private interior of a person, the evidence of who they actually were, and with Evelyn, those were harder to read. He tried not to look too hard. He had his own reasons for keeping a certain distance between himself and the interior lives of the people around him, and he respected those reasons, and he told himself this extended to her. But the mind does what it wants when you're not watching, and what is kept doing was noticing things about her. She watched the mountains in the mornings when she had a moment between tasks, not casually, with a focused attention, as if she was memorizing them, or as if they said something she needed to understand. The first time he noticed this, he was moving through the hallway past the window and saw her standing at the glass with her coffee, and he stopped before she heard him and stood there for a moment watching her watch the mountains. There was something in her face he'd not seen before. Not the careful blankness she wore when people were around. Not the quick, practical focus she brought to work. Something open and private and completely undefended. He moved on before she could turn around. Another thing, she hummed. Not often and not loud, just occasionally, when she was working alone in the kitchen or the barn and presumably thought no one was near. It wasn't a song he recognized, just a low melodic sound, vaguely rhythmic, that stopped the moment she heard anyone coming. The first time he heard it, he stood in the hallway outside the kitchen door for a few seconds longer than he should have, listening to the sound of it before he deliberately made his footsteps audible and heard it stop. He didn't know why it mattered. He knew that it did. The gelding's leg healed completely in the first week of March. He found this out when Russ came to tell him, with the mildly baffled expression of a man who'd expected different news, that the horse was sound. Fully sound, moving on it without any favor. Russ had owned horses for 30 years and had seen that particular kind of damage go three directions: healed partial, healed slow, or not healed at all. But he'd never seen one come back that clean, and he said so. "It's the poultice," Nathaniel said. "I know it's the poultice." Russ turned his hat in his hands. "I looked up what she used: cedar oil, comfrey root, something else I couldn't identify. I asked her." He paused. "She wrote it down for me. Plantain leaf." "Plantain." "From the field behind the east fence. She'd dried it and ground it." Russ looked at him. "She went out there in January, Nathaniel. In January, she went to that field and found plantain under the snow." Nathaniel didn't say anything. "I just think," Russ said carefully, "that she's not what she looks like." "I know that." "Do you know what she is?" It was a genuine question, not a challenge, and Nathaniel looked at it honestly. "No," he said. "Not entirely." Russ put his hat back on. "That makes two of us," he said, and went back out. Nathaniel went to find Evelyn. She was in the kitchen garden, or what would be the kitchen garden come spring, which right now was just a rectangle of snow-covered ground behind the house. She was standing at the edge of it with her hands in her coat pockets, looking at it with the same concentrated attention she brought to the mountains in the mornings. "Russ told me about the horse," he said. She looked at him. "That was exceptional work," he said. He said it straightforwardly, the way he'd say it to a hand who'd done something well, because she wasn't the kind of person who benefited from softening, and he was starting to understand that about her. "I don't say that easily." She held his eyes for a moment. Then she looked back at the garden and pointed at a section of it, then made the motion he'd learned meant what. "What's there?" he said. "Nothing yet. It's been fallow 2 winters." She looked at him with an expression that said she found this wasteful. "I had a cook who managed it before," he said. "She left." Evelyn pointed at herself. He looked at her. "You want to work the garden?" Not a question, but she nodded anyway. "That's—" "Yes," he said. "If you want to, that's fine." She looked back at the garden, and he could see her thinking, planning something, the way she got when she was looking at a problem and locating its solution. He stood next to her and looked at the snow-covered ground and tried to see what she was seeing. "What are you going to plant?" he asked. She gave him a look that clearly indicated he'd need to wait and find out, and went back inside. He went through his wife's things in mid-March. He did this once a year, usually in spring when the light came back and staying inside with himself got harder. It wasn't grief exactly, or it wasn't only grief. It was more like a form of accounting, a yearly review of what he'd carried and what he'd put down and what he was carrying still. Ellen had been gone 4 years, and the shape of the loss had changed in that time, grown less sharp but more constant, the way a scar settles into skin. He didn't want to stop feeling it. It was the last evidence of something that had been true. He was in the bedroom going through the cedar chest when he became aware that Evelyn was in the doorway. He didn't look up immediately. He had his hands on a folded quilt, and he finished folding it the way he'd been folding it and set it aside, and then he looked at the doorway. She was standing there with a cup of coffee and a look on her face that was asking, very plainly, whether to stay or go. "You can come in," he said. She came in and set the coffee on the dresser near him and looked at the chest and then at him. Waiting, he understood, in case he wanted to talk. Not expecting him to, just making herself available in the same way she made herself available for everything, quietly, without making a production of it. Her name was Ellen, he said. He didn't plan to say it. She died of fever in the winter of '78. Evelyn sat down in the chair near the window. Not close, not far, present. I should have been here, he said. I was in Cheyenne for 2 weeks handling a land dispute. She got sick fast. By the time I knew and got back, he stopped. He didn't finish that sentence because there was no finishing it that made it better or different or less true. He picked up the coffee and drank some and looked out the window at the yard, which was showing the first tentative signs of the cold loosening. Patches of ground visible through the snow near the fence posts, the light staying a little longer each day. I told myself for a long time that it wouldn't have changed anything, he said. If I'd been here, that it happened too fast, that there was nothing. He stopped again. I don't know if that's true. I never will know. That's the part I haven't been able to put down. He looked at her. She was watching him with the same careful openness she'd shown him that night in the study with the books, and there was no pity in it, which was why he'd kept talking. She wasn't looking at him like he was something broken. She was looking at him like he was someone who'd said a true thing. He cleared his throat. I'm not telling you what to do with that, he said. It's just, you've been in this house long enough that it seemed wrong not to say it. She nodded once. Not, I understand exactly. More like, thank you for saying it. The distinction was small, but it was real, and he felt it. He went back to the chest, and she stayed in the chair, and they were quiet together for a while. And it was the most comfortable he'd felt in a room with another person in longer than he could clearly remember. The thaw began in earnest the last week of March, which meant the mud season, which meant the ranch operations that had been suspended for winter could start again, which meant more people moving through the property and more noise and more of the ordinary friction of a working place coming back to life after months of dormancy. Evelyn adapted to this the way she adapted to everything, by observing it, locating its rhythms, and finding where she fit inside them. She was in the kitchen garden every morning now, even in the cold, working the ground by hand with a focus that Nathaniel recognized as the same focus she brought to the horse's leg, to the reorganized tack room, to everything she put her attention on. She knew what she was doing. He'd stopped being surprised by this. What he hadn't expected was that the hands would start going to her with things. It started with Pete, which made a certain sense given their history. He'd come around from his early resistance with an enthusiasm that suggested he was making up for it. He went to Evelyn about a persistent cut on his hand that wasn't healing right, and she cleaned it and bandaged it with something from a collection of supplies she'd assembled in a corner of the kitchen that Margaret had cleared for her, and within a week it was fine. Word of this moved through the bunkhouse the way word of anything moved through a bunkhouse, fast and without attribution. And by the second week of April, she'd looked at a cough that one of the younger hands had been carrying since February, a bruised rib on a man who'd taken a fall from a horse, and a recurring problem with Russ's right hand that he'd been keeping quiet about for 2 months. You let her look at it? Nathaniel asked Russ. Russ examined his right hand, which was moving better than it had in weeks. She didn't give me a lot of choice, he said. She noticed I was favoring it and pointed at a chair. And you sat down. I sat down, Russ said, without embarrassment. She put something on it and wrapped it and told me to keep it wrapped for 4 days. He paused. She told me by writing it down on a piece of paper. She'd already written it before I sat down. She knew what it was before she even looked. Nathaniel looked at his foreman for a moment. What did she say it was? Tendons, Russ said. She wrote tendons, not joints. She was right. Feels completely different when it's wrapped the way she did it. Nathaniel thought about the veterinary book marked at the chapter on joint inflammation. He thought about the plantain under the snow in January. She's had some kind of training, he said. It wasn't a question. More than some, Russ said. That's my guess. The question of where it had come from and what else she'd had and lost sat in Nathaniel's mind for the rest of the day. He didn't ask her. He was learning the shape of what she'd tell and what she wouldn't, the way you learn the geography of a piece of land, not by forcing it to yield everything at once, but by moving through it slowly and paying attention to what it showed you. She planted the kitchen garden in the 3rd week of April. He came out in the early morning to find her already at it, working with a systematic precision that showed she'd planned the whole thing out in her head over the winter months. She had seedlings she'd started indoors from seeds she'd asked Margaret to order when the last supply run went to town, had written a list in her careful handwriting and given it to Margaret without fanfare, and Margaret had ordered everything without mentioning it to Nathaniel until the supplies arrived, at which point she'd told him as a matter of information rather than asking permission. He'd said fine. He stood at the edge of the garden now in the early April light and watched her work. The ground had been turned already, she'd done it over several days in the preceding week, and she was setting seedlings in with a spacing that seemed deliberate and specific, not the random optimism he'd seen other kitchen gardens planted with. "You planned this out over the winter," he said. She looked up at him. Then she looked at the garden and made a small motion with one hand that he read as obviously. "What are you putting there?" He pointed at the far corner, which she seemed to be leaving empty. She stood and went to that corner and crouched down and touched the soil, and then she made a gesture he didn't know. "I don't—" He stopped. "Show me." She looked at him for a moment, and then she did something she hadn't done before. She crossed the garden to where he was standing and took his hand and led him to the corner and crouched down and pointed at the soil close up, then made the gesture again. It was a spreading motion, fingers opening outward from a central point. "Something that spreads," he said. She nodded and touched his hand to the soil. It was damp and cold and dark with organic materials she'd worked into it over the past weeks. "Medicinal?" he guessed. She looked at him with an expression that said he was getting warmer. "The things you've been using," he said. "You want to grow them." She let go of his hand and stood up, and the look on her face was not the careful blankness and not the focused, practical attention. It was something closer to the open, private expression she had when she looked at the mountains, and he understood that this mattered to her in a way that went past practical. She wanted a place where things grew that she'd put there, a piece of ground that was hers, at least in the way that tending makes a thing yours. After 3 years of working for a man who told her she owed him everything, she wanted to plant something that belonged to nobody but itself and that she had chosen to put in the ground. He didn't say any of that. He said, "Plant what you need." She looked at him. "This corner," he said. "The whole corner, whatever you want." She turned and looked at the corner of the garden, and he watched her face, and the thing he saw there was brief and quickly managed, but it was real, and it was something he hadn't seen from her before. Relief. Not performed relief, not gratitude deployed to make him feel good about himself, just the private, involuntary relief of someone who'd been holding themselves ready for a no and heard a yes instead. He went back inside before it could become something they'd both have to deal with. April moved toward May, and with it came the full return of the working season. Cattle moved back to the upper pastures, fences checked and repaired, the spring buying trip planned and prepared for. Nathaniel was pulled back into the operational life of the ranch in the way that spring always pulled him, and the long interior winter with its quiet and its unusual companionship gave way to something busier and more diffuse. He noticed the change. He noticed specifically the way the weeks of winter felt different from the weeks of spring, and he spent some time being honest with himself about why. The ranch was full of people again. There was always someone around, always a conversation or a task that needed his attention, always a reason to be moving. And Evelyn was still there, still doing her work, still in the kitchen garden in the mornings, and the barn in the evenings, and the kitchen at mealtimes. She was still there, but there were fewer evenings now when it was just the two of them on either side of a silence that had started to feel, in its specific quality, like something he was going to miss when it ended. He was in the study one evening in late April, working through the logistics of the spring buying trip, when Margaret knocked. "There's a man at the gate," she said. "He says his name is Voss. Alexander Voss. He has 2 men with him." She paused. "He says he has business with the ranch." "What kind of business?" Margaret's expression told him she knew more than she was saying, and that she was deciding how much of it to say. "He asked for Evelyn by name," she said. The pen stopped moving in Nathaniel's hand. He put it down. "He asked for her by name?" he said. "By name," Margaret said. "Said he'd been looking for her since November." Nathaniel stood up slowly. He looked at the window. Outside, the evening was clear and cold, the sky going dark at the edges, the yard lit by the lamps along the fence. He could see, at the gate, the shapes of 3 horses. "Where is she?" he said. "Kitchen. She doesn't know yet." He moved to the door and Margaret stepped back. "Don't tell her yet," he said. "I'll go see what he wants." He walked out into the evening and across the yard toward the gate. And as he walked, the feeling he'd been managing carefully for weeks, the careful distance he'd kept between himself and what he was starting to feel, clarified into something simpler and colder and much easier to name. The man at the gate was well dressed for the frontier, with the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no in a way that stuck. And when he saw Nathaniel coming, he smiled the way men like that smile, pleasantly, emptily, with nothing behind it. "Mr. Cross," he said, "my name is Alexander Voss. I believe you have something of mine." Nathaniel looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to need to be more specific," he said. Voss didn't get off his horse. That was the first thing Nathaniel noted. The deliberate choice of it, staying mounted while talking to the man whose gate he was standing at, the particular dominance of looking down at someone while conducting what was supposed to be a civil conversation. He'd seen it done before. It was the kind of thing men did when they wanted you to feel the difference in your positions before a single word was exchanged. Nathaniel put his hands in his coat pockets and looked up at him without expression. "I'll say it plainly," Voss said. He had a voice trained for rooms, carrying and measured, the kind of voice that expected to be listened to. He was somewhere past 50, lean in the face, with pale eyes that moved over the ranch behind Nathaniel with the assessing quality of someone calculating value. "A woman named Evelyn Hart has been in your household since November. She's here under a misapprehension. She left a legal contract unfulfilled, and that contract has my name on it." "What kind of contract?" "A debt instrument. Her father borrowed money from my operation 7 years ago. When he died, the debt transferred. She agreed to work it off. That agreement was written, witnessed, and filed with the county clerk in Sheridan." Voss reached into his coat and produced a folded set of papers, which he held out toward Nathaniel without leaning down to make it easy to take. "I have the documentation." Nathaniel didn't reach for it. "Send one of your men down with it." A pause. Voss looked at him for a moment, then nodded at the man on his left, who brought his horse forward and handed the papers across the fence. Nathaniel took them, unfolded them, in the evening light, and read. It took him several minutes. He read carefully, the way he read contracts, which was the way you read anything that someone was using to compel you toward a conclusion, looking for what it said and what it didn't say, and the space between those two things where the real meaning lived. The document was 3 pages. It was written in the formal legal language of the territory, properly formatted, with witness signatures and a notary stamp from Sheridan County. Evelyn's signature, or what purported to be her signature, was on the second page in a hand that looked nothing like the careful, precise writing he'd seen from her. But signatures could look different from ordinary writing. He couldn't say it wasn't hers. The contract stipulated that in exchange for the forgiveness of a debt of $420, one Evelyn Catherine Hart agreed to provide domestic labor services to the household of Alexander Voss for a period not to exceed 5 years, during which time room and board would be provided in lieu of wages. It was dated 6 years ago. She would have been, he did the arithmetic, approximately 19. He folded the papers. "This says 5 years, he said. "She's been gone since November. That's 5 months short." "Correct." "What does 5 months of her time cost you?" Voss's expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes did, a slight sharpening, a reassessment. He'd expected something different, Nathaniel guessed. Outrage, maybe, or immediate capitulation. He hadn't expected arithmetic. "This isn't a commercial transaction, Mr. Cross. It's a legal obligation." "Everything is a commercial transaction," Nathaniel said. "Name a number." "She comes back to complete her contract," Voss said. "That's the only resolution I'm interested in." Nathaniel looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the 2 men behind him, both younger, both watching this exchange with the alert stillness of men who'd been in a few of these situations before and knew when to pay attention. "You'll need to give me time to consult legal counsel," Nathaniel said. This is a significant document, and I'm not in a position to respond to it tonight. I can give you until noon tomorrow, Voss said. You'll give me a week, Nathaniel said, in exactly the tone he used when the negotiation was over and he was telling someone what was going to happen. You've been looking for her since November. Another week doesn't change your position materially. Writing to the county seat and filing a complaint, on the other hand, takes 2 days and costs you time and money. We both know that. Voss was quiet. He looked at Nathaniel the way men looked at other men when they were revising their estimates. 3 days, he said. Fine, Nathaniel said. Where are you staying? Elk Creek. I'll send word. He turned and walked back toward the house without waiting to see them go, and he heard the horses move away behind him, and the gate close, and he kept walking until he was inside and the door was shut. Margaret was in the hallway. Where is she? He said. Still in the kitchen. I told her you were dealing with a business matter. He went to the kitchen. Evelyn was at the table with a cup of tea and the natural history book, and she looked up when he came in, and whatever she saw in his face made her set the book down and straighten in the chair. He sat down across from her and put Voss's papers on the table between them and didn't say anything yet, giving her a moment to see what they were. She looked at the papers. She didn't touch them. Then she looked at him, and the careful blankness was completely gone, and what was underneath it was something he'd only seen once before. That involuntary, unmanaged expression, but not relief this time. Something older and more tired than fear. I need to know if this contract is real, he said. I need to know what actually happened. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she reached across the table and pulled the papers to her and read through them in the way she read everything, completely, precisely, without hurrying. When she finished, she set them back down and sat back. She pointed at the signature on the second page. Then she shook her head. That's not your signature, he said. She shook her head again. But the rest of it, the debt, your father, that's real. She was still for a moment. Then she nodded. One small, careful nod. He sat back. He looked at the papers and thought about the space between what a document said and what was actually true, and about how wide that space could get when the person who held the pen had enough money to make his version of things the official version. How much of the debt was real? She held up 2 fingers. 200? He watched her. Your father actually borrowed 200. The document says 420. She pointed at the document and then made a motion he'd learned. Fingers rubbing together, the gesture for money added on. He inflated it, Nathaniel said. She nodded. And the signature? She pointed at her own hand and then shook her head and made a writing motion that turned into, he watched carefully, a gesture of coercion. Someone else's hand over hers. Forced. He was quiet for a long time. How old were you? He asked, though he already knew. She looked at the table and held up both hands, 10 fingers, and then 9 more. 19. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them and did not say the things he was thinking because they weren't useful right now, and she didn't need his anger, she needed his attention. I'm going to Laramie tomorrow, he said. I know a lawyer there. I want you to write down everything. Your father's original debt, what you were told it was, what you signed and how, what you were paid, all of it. Every detail you can remember. Dates if you have them. Names of anyone who witnessed anything. He looked at her. Can you do that? She looked at him with the directness she used when she meant what she was about to communicate completely, and she nodded. Good, he said. He stood up and picked up the papers. At the door, he stopped. He turned back. He's not taking you anywhere, he said. It came out with more certainty than he'd intended, more personal than he'd planned, and he heard it and decided it was accurate and left it there. She was watching him when he said it, and he left before he could see what her face did. He rode to Laramie the next morning before dawn. Charlotte Bennett's office was on the 2nd floor of a building on the main street, above a land essay office, and it had her name on the door in plain letters without ornamentation. He'd met her twice before, once at a property dispute that had gone to the territorial court, once at a dinner he'd attended with a man whose name he'd since forgotten. He knew she was sharp, that she'd won cases other lawyers had given up on, and that she charged fees that reflected this without apology. She was at her desk when he arrived, which told him she started early. She was somewhere in her late 30s with a direct manner that reminded him, unexpectedly and uncomfortably, of Evelyn, in the sense that she didn't adjust her presentation based on who she was talking to. "Mr. Cross," she said, "sit down." He sat. He put Voss's papers on her desk and Evelyn's written account beside them, 12 pages of careful handwriting that she'd worked on through the night, that Margaret had brought to him before he left with a look that said she'd stayed up with her while she did it. Charlotte read both documents completely before she said a word. He waited. He was good at waiting. "Alexander Voss," she said finally. She said it the way you say the name of something you already know. "You know him?" "I know of him. He runs what he calls a labor brokerage out of Sheridan. He finds people in debt situations and acquires the debt and converts it into labor contracts." She set the papers down with a precision that suggested she'd like to do something else with them. "He's done this at least a dozen times that I know of, all technically legal. He's very careful about the technical legality." She says the signature on the contract is forged. I believe her. The signature looks nothing like her natural handwriting. Charlotte tapped the 12 pages. "This account is detailed and internally consistent. She has dates, she has names, she remembers the specific amount differently from what the contract states, and her explanation of how the discrepancy was introduced is plausible and consistent with what I know about how Voss operates." "Can you fight the contract?" "I can fight the contract," Charlotte said. "Forgery is a criminal matter, not just civil. If we can demonstrate the signature is fraudulent, the contract is void. But," she put her hands on the desk, "Voss has a notary stamp on that document and a witness signature from a man who, I can tell you right now, has signed a number of documents for Voss over the years and has never yet appeared in a courtroom to be questioned about them. Demonstrating forgery means proving a negative in front of a judge who may or may not be sympathetic against a man who has been doing this for a decade without losing a case. What do we need? Time, evidence, ideally, other people who've been in the same situation and are willing to say so." She looked at him steadily. "And money, Mr. Cross. This will not be inexpensive." "Tell me what it costs," he said. She named a number. He didn't blink. "There's something else," Charlotte said. She turned over one of the pages of Evelyn's account and looked at it. She mentions another woman, a woman named Sutter, Clara Sutter, who was also in Voss's household during the time Evelyn was there. She says this woman was in a similar situation, that she'd tried to leave before and been brought back. "Do you know where she is?" "No, but if she's willing to testify, her account corroborates Evelyn's on the key points: forgery, inflated debt, coercion." Charlotte put the paper down. "Finding her would change what this case looks like considerably." "Find her," he said. Charlotte looked at him for a moment with the evaluating expression of someone deciding how much of what they're thinking to say out loud. "Mr. Cross," she said, "this woman, Evelyn, she's not family, is she? She's not a relative, there's no prior obligation." "No," he said. "Then I'll ask you plainly. What is she to you?" He looked at the window, at the Laramie Street outside. "Someone who's in my household," he said. "Someone who's been treated badly by someone who had the legal means to get away with it." He looked back at Charlotte. "That's enough." Charlotte seemed to accept this. "I'll need 3 days to review the documents fully and begin drafting a response to Voss. Don't let him near her in the meantime." "He gets nowhere near her," Nathaniel said. He rode home. He told Evelyn that evening everything Charlotte had said, including the assessment of the difficulty and the cost. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and told her straight, because she was a person who deserved to be told straight. She listened with the particular quality of attention she had, completely still, taking in everything, giving nothing away on her face until he was finished. When he stopped talking, she was quiet for a moment. Then she reached for a piece of paper and wrote something and pushed it across the table. "You don't have to do this. It's my problem." He looked at the paper and then at her. "I know I don't have to," he said. She looked at him. Then she wrote again. "Why?" Not a question mark, just the word. He thought about Charlotte's question. What is she to you? and the answer he'd given, which was accurate as far as it went, and didn't go as far as the truth. He thought about the plantain under the snow, and the horse's leg healing, and the surveying journals, and the open expression on her face when she looked at the mountains. He thought about sitting in Ellen's bedroom and telling a woman who couldn't speak about the worst thing that had ever happened to him, and the quality of her silence, and the particular way she'd sat. Present, not pitying, not performing comfort, just there. "Because it's right," he said, which was true and insufficient. "And because you earned it." She looked at him for a long time. Then she took the paper back and folded it and put it in her pocket, and she looked at the table, and he could see something working through her face that she was managing, not quite successfully, which was rare. She had a crack in the composure, and she was aware of it and working to close it. He looked away to give her privacy with it. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow I need you to write down anything else you can remember about the Sutter woman. Where she was from, anything she told you about herself." She nodded, not looking at him yet. He got up and went to the door. "Evelyn." She looked up. "I meant what I said last night," he said. "He's not taking you anywhere." He left before it became more than that. But the 3 days passed with a specific tension that sat over the ranch like weather. Russ knew something was happening. Nathaniel had told him the basics, because Russ needed to know, and because he was one of the few people whose judgment Nathaniel trusted without reservation. The hands could see something was different without knowing what, and they responded the way ranch hands responded to unspecified trouble, which was to stay busy and stay out of the way. Evelyn was quieter than usual, not withdrawn. She did her work and was in the kitchen at mealtimes and spent her evenings in the study now, writing out everything she could remember about Clara Sutter in the painstaking, careful way she wrote everything. But she had the look of someone who was waiting for something, and the waiting had a quality to it that was different from her ordinary patience. This was the patience of someone who had been waiting for bad things before and knew what it felt like, and was managing the knowing. On the third morning, Nathaniel came downstairs before light and found her sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of tea, not reading, not writing, just sitting. He started the stove without talking. He made coffee and put a cup in front of her and sat down. She looked at the coffee, then at him. "It's going to be a fight," he said. "I'm not going to lie to you about that. The contract exists, it's filed, and Voss has done this enough times that he knows how to make it difficult. Charlotte is good, but good isn't the same as easy." She nodded. She'd known this. He could see she'd known it. "But the contract is built on a lie," he said. "That matters. It's slower to prove than it should be, but it matters." He looked at her. "Have you been through legal proceedings before?" She shook her head. "It's not comfortable," he said, picking the word carefully. "There will be people who question everything you say, people who are paid to make you look unreliable. Voss will have a lawyer who is very good at that." He paused. "I need you to know what you're agreeing to before you agree to it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached for a piece of paper that was already on the table. She'd been writing earlier, he realized, before he came down, and pushed it toward him. "I know what I'm agreeing to. I've been questioned by men like Voss before. They're only frightening until you decide they're not." He read it. He looked at her. "You decided that," he said. She held up 2 fingers. Her second winter at Voss's place, he understood. 2 years in, she'd made that decision. "What changed?" he asked. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she picked up the pen and wrote. "I found out he'd done it to someone else. It wasn't just about me anymore." He sat with that. She'd stopped looking at it as only her situation. He didn't know what to say about that, so he didn't say anything. He drank his coffee, and she drank hers, and the kitchen filled gradually with the gray pre-dawn light that came before the sun cleared the mountains. Voss arrived at noon exactly. He came alone this time, which was a choice, leaving the 2 men behind, signaling confidence, or what he wanted Nathaniel to read as confidence. He was shown to the front room, which is where Nathaniel received business visitors, and he sat down across from Nathaniel with the ease of someone who considered any room he entered his own. 3 days, Voss said. "I assume you've had time to review the document thoroughly." "I have," Nathaniel said. "I've also retained legal counsel." Voss's expression stayed pleasant. "Of course. Who did you engage?" "Charlotte Bennett." A pause. Very small. Nathaniel caught it. Ms. Bennett is accomplished, Voss said. I'm sure she's told you the contract is sound. She's told me the contract has some questions around it, Nathaniel said, specifically around the signature on the second page. The signature was witnessed by a man who seems to witness a great number of your documents. Nathaniel kept his voice even, conversational, the way he conducted negotiations he expected to take a while. That's the kind of thing that gets noticed when it goes in front of a judge. A witness who's appeared on 8 or 9 of your contracts over the years. A judge starts wondering whether this man is just uncommonly civic-minded, or whether there's another explanation. Voss looked at him steadily. The pleasantness hadn't left his face entirely, but it had become a different kind of pleasantness. Deliberate, deployed. Mr. Cross, I've been doing business in this territory for 15 years. I've had my contracts reviewed by territorial courts, county courts, and the district court on 2 occasions. I have not lost. There's a first time, Nathaniel said. I would hate for this to become adversarial, Voss said. I came here prepared to discuss a resolution. The woman has 5 months remaining on her contract. I'm prepared to offer a financial settlement for that time. A modest one, given the circumstances, but something. She's not a financial settlement, Nathaniel said. She's a person. She's a party to a legal contract. A contract with a forged signature. Voss set down the cup he'd been holding. I'm going to be direct with you, he said. You've taken an interest in this woman. I understand that. But you are making a business decision that will cost you significantly in money and in reputation for someone who cannot contribute proportionately to the outcome. I'm offering you a clean exit. I'm not looking for an exit. Then what are you looking for? Nathaniel looked at him across the room. He thought about Evelyn's 12 pages of handwriting, each letter formed with that particular deliberateness. He thought about, I found out he'd done it to someone else. He thought about Clara Sutter, wherever she was, and however many other women with forged signatures and inflated debts were out there. I'm looking for the rest of it, Nathaniel said. Every contract you've written like this one, every name on every document. I'm looking for how many times you've done this and to how many people, and I'm going to make sure every piece of it ends up in front of a judge. The room was quiet for a moment. Voss stood up. The pleasantness was gone now, fully, and what was under it was what Nathaniel had suspected was under it, something harder and more considered and much less friendly. You don't know what you're starting, he said. I know exactly what I'm starting, Nathaniel said. I've been in negotiations like this one for 20 years. I know what a man looks like when he's just realized the other side isn't going to move. Voss looked at him for a moment with the specific look of someone who has just revised an assessment downward and found the revision unpleasant. Then he picked up his hat from the table beside him. You'll be hearing from my lawyer, he said. Charlotte will be glad to hear from him, Nathaniel said. He showed Voss out himself and watched him ride away and stood in the yard afterward in the afternoon sun, feeling the weight of what he'd just committed to as a specific physical thing in his chest. He'd known men like Voss his entire life. He knew what fighting them cost. Not just money, though the money would be significant. Men like Voss had networks, obligations they were owed by people in positions, pressure they could apply in directions you didn't see coming. He told Voss he knew what he was starting, and he did, and knowing it was not the same as being ready for it. Russ found him in the yard. He left quick, Russ said. He'll be back, Nathaniel said. Not in person. Russ was quiet for a moment. What do you need from me? Your honesty, Nathaniel said. Do you think I'm making a mistake? Russ turned his hat in his hands, which was what he did when he was constructing an honest answer rather than a diplomatic one. I think, he said slowly, that you haven't made a decision based on something other than the ranch in 4 years. And I think most men I respect have done something in their life that cost more than it should have, and were better for it. He paused. That's not exactly an answer. It's close enough, Nathaniel said. He went back inside and found Evelyn in the hallway. She'd heard the door clearly, and she was standing there in the way she stood when she was ready to deal with whatever was coming and wanted to know what it was. He's gone, Nathaniel said. He's going to send his lawyer. This is going to take a while, and it's going to get harder before it gets easier. She looked at him steadily. I told him we're going after the whole operation, he said. Not just your contract, all of them. Her expression changed. Not much, and then quite a lot. He watched the change move through her face, Surprise first, and then something that broke through her composure entirely for just a moment. Something that was both gratitude and grief at the same time. The specific grief of someone who has been alone with a thing for years and suddenly isn't. She pressed her lips together and looked at the floor and got herself back under control, and when she looked up, her eyes were steady again, though not entirely. She pointed at herself, then at him. Then, with a gesture he hadn't seen before, deliberate, considered, she touched the center of her chest and extended her hand toward him. Open palm, extended, not reaching, offering. He understood it. He wasn't sure what to do with it. "We'll figure it out as we go," he said, which was the most honest thing he could say. She closed her hand slowly and nodded. Outside, the afternoon light was moving across the yard and through the kitchen garden, where things she had put in the ground were beginning to come up green and small and entirely determined, and the gelding stood in the paddock on a leg that had healed clean, moving without any sign of the thing that had been wrong with it, which was not something anyone would have predicted in January when the winter was at its worst and the damage was still new. Nathaniel looked at none of this. He was looking at Evelyn. He was thinking about the fact that he had put himself in the way of a man who did not lose, for reasons he had told Charlotte were simple and sufficient, and which were more complicated than that, and that he did not regret it, and that the not regretting it was itself a kind of information he was going to have to decide what to do with. That decision was still some time away. What was immediate was the work, and the fight, and the considerable cost of both. And for the first time in a very long while, immediate was enough. Charlotte's first letter arrived 4 days after Voss rode away from the ranch, and it said what Nathaniel had expected it to say, that Voss's lawyer, a man named Gerald Pruitt out of Cheyenne, had responded to her preliminary inquiry with a letter that was pleasant in tone and completely immovable in substance. The contract was valid. The signature was genuine. Any challenge to either would be met with the full resources of Voss's legal operation, which Pruitt described, with the particular confidence of a man who'd said it before and been right, as considerable. Charlotte added a line at the bottom of her letter in handwriting slightly different from the formal body, as if she'd written it separately and decided to include it. "He moved faster than I expected. He knew we were coming before I sent the first letter. Someone told him." Nathaniel read this line 3 times and then folded the letter and went to find Russ. He found him in the barn, which was where Russ went when he needed to think, and Nathaniel stood in the doorway and said, "Who in Elk Creek knows our business?" Russ turned from the horse he'd been tending. He understood the question immediately. That was the thing about Russ. He processed fast and without drama. "Pete went to town 6 days ago for supplies," he said. "He talks when he drinks, and he drinks when he goes to town." "Does he know enough to do damage?" "He knows you've got a lawyer. He knows it's about Evelyn. He knows Voss was here." Russ paused. "He doesn't mean any harm by it, Nathaniel. He's not malicious. He just doesn't think." "I know that." Nathaniel looked at the barn floor. "I need him to think, or to stop talking, one of the two. I'll handle Pete. Don't make it ugly." "I never make things ugly," Russ said, with the mild dignity of a man who occasionally made things quite ugly and knew it. Nathaniel went back to the house and wrote Charlotte a reply and sent it with one of the hands he trusted, which was a shorter list than it should have been, and he was aware of that. The pressure from Voss came in angles Nathaniel had anticipated, and some he hadn't. The first was financial. 2 weeks after the confrontation in the front room, the bank in Laramie sent a letter informing him that a loan he'd held for 6 years against the South Pasture, a loan he'd been paying reliably, a loan that had never been an issue, was being called due to a change in terms, effective in 30 days. The letter cited a clause in the original document that he'd read at the time and dismissed as boilerplate. He read it again now and saw that it wasn't boilerplate. It was a real clause, and someone had activated it. He paid the loan off. It cost him considerably, and it meant liquidating an investment he'd been holding for 3 years, but he paid it, because the alternative was Voss having a mechanism to pressure him through the bank, and he wasn't going to let that stand. Charlotte, when he told her, was quiet on her end of the letter for what felt like several days before she replied. Her response was measured and careful. "This is what I meant about cost. He's going to make this expensive in every direction he can find. He's done it before. The question is how long you can sustain it." The question also was how long Evelyn could sustain the waiting. He watched her through May and into June, the way he watched things he was worried about. Not directly, not in a way that would make her feel observed, but consistently. She was still doing her work. The garden was coming in better than any kitchen garden the ranch had seen in years, and she was managing it with the same focused competence she brought to everything. And the medicinal corner in the far end was filling in with things he couldn't name that she tended with a particular attention she didn't give even to the vegetables. But she slept badly. He knew this because he slept badly himself, and heard her sometimes in the night, moving in the room above his study, the careful, quiet footsteps of someone trying not to wake anyone. And she had days where the blankness came back fully, not the careful, controlled version she wore in company, but a deeper kind, the kind that meant she was somewhere else inside herself, and the somewhere else was not good. On one of those days, he found her standing at the kitchen garden fence in the late afternoon doing nothing, which was something he'd never seen her do. She was just standing there with her hands on the top rail and her eyes on the plants she'd put in the ground, and her face had the expression of someone who was trying to remember why something mattered. He stood beside her at the fence and looked at the garden. "Charlotte found Clara Sutter," he said. Evelyn turned sharply. The blankness broke immediately. "She's in Casper," he said. "She left Voss's operation 2 years ago. She's been working at a dry goods store. Charlotte sent someone to talk to her." He paused. "She's willing to testify." Evelyn gripped the fence rail. She was looking at him with an intensity that was different from her usual directness, less controlled, more urgent. "She remembered you," he said. "That's what Charlotte's letter said. She specifically asked if you were well." Evelyn looked away at the mountains and pressed her lips together hard, and Nathaniel looked at the garden and gave her whatever time she needed with that. After a while, she reached into her apron pocket and found a scrap of paper and a pencil she kept there. She'd taken to carrying these always, he'd noticed, the way someone carries a tool they've learned to rely on. And she wrote something and held it out without looking at him. "She tried to leave before I did. He had her brought back. I watched it happen." He read it. He thought about 19-year-old Evelyn watching someone be brought back, and deciding then or later what she was going to do about it. "She knows that," he said. "Charlotte said she talked for 2 hours. She knows everything Voss did." Evelyn took the paper back and wrote again. "Will it be enough?" "I don't know, Ick," he said. "Charlotte thinks yes. She says 2 witnesses with consistent accounts of the same methods, plus the handwriting evidence on the signature. It's a strong case." He looked at her. "But Voss has a judge in Sheridan County who's ruled in his favor twice. We're trying to move the venue to Laramie District Court, which Charlotte knows better and where Voss has less history. That's taking time." She nodded slowly. She was back fully now. He could see it, the return of the focused, practical Evelyn from whatever interior place the other one had been standing in. She wrote one more line. "How much is this costing you?" "That's not your concern," he said. She gave him the impatient look. "It's being managed," he said. "Don't worry about the money." She wrote, "You're selling things." He looked at her. "Who told you that?" She pointed at herself and then made a gesture he hadn't seen. Fingers spread, head tilted, the look of someone who pays attention to everything around them. "Margaret," he guessed. She didn't confirm it. He suspected it was less Margaret telling her and more Evelyn simply noticing the things that changed, which investments disappeared from the papers on his desk, which conversations with Russ had a certain texture, which decisions he made and which ones he deferred. She noticed everything. He kept forgetting that. "It's my money to spend," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she wrote something longer than usual and handed it over. "You told me when I came here that I didn't owe you anything. I'm telling you the same. You can stop this. Voss will take the settlement and leave. I've survived worse situations than losing. I don't want you to spend everything you've built on me." He read it twice. He looked at the garden, at the things she'd planted that were growing, at the medicinal corner that was filling in. He thought about Ellen's cedar chest and the morning he'd sat in that room and told her things he hadn't said to anyone, and her sitting there, not pitying him, just present. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She nodded. "When you left Voss's place in November, what made you do it then? You'd been there 3 years. What was different about November?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden. Then she wrote, He took on a new girl. She was 17. She had her father's signature on a document she'd never read. He stood with that. "So you left," he said, "knowing he'd come after you, knowing you had nowhere to go." She nodded. "And now you're telling me I should let you go back." She looked at him. Something in her face moved. A conflict, briefly visible, between the practical argument she was making and something underneath it that contradicted it. She looked away. She wrote, "I'm telling you that I understand if you need to." "I don't need to," he said, "and I'm not going to." He put his hands in his pockets. "The garden looks good," he said, which was a way of closing the subject that she accepted, after a moment, with a small nod. He walked back toward the house and didn't look back, and he didn't examine too carefully the particular solidity he felt, the specific quality of being certain about something without fully understanding yet what the something was. June brought the second wave of pressure, which was the one he hadn't anticipated. Two of the men who'd contracted to buy cattle from the Cross Ranch in the fall sent letters within a week of each other canceling their orders. Both letters were polite. Neither gave a specific reason. One mentioned, vaguely, having made alternative arrangements. Nathaniel read both letters and read them again, and then sent inquiries through two different channels and got back the same answer both times. Word had gotten around that Cross was in a legal dispute with Alexander Voss, and that the smart money was to wait and see how it resolved before committing. That was 400 head of cattle without a buyer going into fall. He told Russ. Russ sat with it for a moment. "How bad?" he said. "Manageable," Nathaniel said. "If I move fast, I can find buyers in Cheyenne. It'll cost me on the price. I'll be selling late, and they'll know it." He looked at the wall. "Voss knows that too. He's not trying to ruin me. He's trying to make this expensive enough that the rational choice is to stop." "Is there a number?" Russ said carefully, "where stopping becomes the rational choice?" Nathaniel looked at him. "I'm asking honestly," Russ said, "not pushing either way. Just, is there a point?" "No," Nathaniel said. He said it without heat, just as a statement of arithmetic. "There's not a point. We're seeing this through." Russ nodded. "Then I'll go to Cheyenne," he said. "I know a man there who takes late cattle if the price is right. He's not generous, but he's reliable." "Take Pete," Nathaniel said. "Get him out of Elk Creek for a while." Russ almost smiled. "Good idea," he said. The letter from Charlotte in the third week of June was the one that changed the shape of the whole thing. She'd found two more women, not in Casper, in Rawlins, which was south, a 2-day ride, and the fact that Voss's operation extended that far told Nathaniel something about the scale of what they were actually dealing with. One of the women, a woman named Dorothy Haas, had been in a contract situation with Voss 4 years ago and had managed to pay what she believed was her actual debt, which was significantly less than the contract amount, by borrowing money from her brother. She had a letter from Voss's operation acknowledging partial payment and releasing her from the contract, and Charlotte believed this letter, combined with the accounting in it, demonstrated conclusively that Voss knew the real debt amount differed from the contract amount, because the release letter used the lower number without acknowledging the discrepancy. Charlotte's letter ended. "This is the piece we needed. Bring Evelyn to Laramie. We need to prepare her testimony, and I need to brief all 3 women together before we file." He took the letter to Evelyn that evening. She read it at the kitchen table with Margaret sitting nearby, pretending to do something that didn't require her full attention, which was Margaret's way of being available without intruding. He watched Evelyn's face as she read, and saw the moment she got to the part about Dorothy Haas's letter, saw something shift in her expression. A loosening, faint but real, like a muscle that had been held tense for a long time being told it could let go slightly. She looked up. "We need to go to Laramie," he said. "You and me. Charlotte wants 2 days to prepare." She looked at him for a moment, and then she looked at Margaret. Margaret said, "I'll manage the house. Go." They rode to Laramie in 2 days. He'd offered the wagon, but she'd chosen to ride, and he'd looked at her choice and said nothing about it, because it was her choice, and because there was something telling about it. She rode like someone who had ridden before things went wrong, before she'd been in places where choices were made for her, and being on horseback was one of the specific ways her competence showed up unguarded. She rode well. He noted this and filed it with everything else he'd noted and filed over the past 6 months without quite knowing what he was going to do with the file. They didn't talk, which was not unusual and not uncomfortable. And the country between the ranch and Laramie was the kind of country that didn't demand commentary, wide and high and various. The mountains still showing snow at the peaks, even in June. The lower slopes green and dense, and the road running through it with the particular indifference of roads to the purposes people put them to. On the second day, late afternoon, with Laramie visible in the distance, she pulled her horse level with his and reached over and tapped his arm. He looked at her. She pointed at herself, then at the mountains to the west, then made a question with her expression. "Have I been up there?" he said. "Yes, most of the high country west of the ranch is crossland, or was. I've sold some of it." He looked at the mountains. "We used to run cattle up there in summer. It's good pasture if you can get them up the trail." She looked at the mountains with that focused attention she gave to distances and things she was memorizing. "Ellen liked it up there," he said. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out in the ordinary way that true things sometimes came out when he wasn't managing himself carefully. She wanted to build a summer cabin. We talked about it. He was quiet for a moment. "We didn't get to it." Evelyn looked at him. Not the brief direct look and not the careful open look. Something between, something that held both the steadiness and the openness at the same time. She didn't write anything. She just looked at him and then looked back at the mountains. And it was enough, he found. It was sufficient. They rode into Laramie as the light went gold. Charlotte's office felt smaller with 4 women in it. Evelyn and Clara Sutter had not seen each other in over 2 years, and the reunion, if that was the word for it, was quiet and had a quality Nathaniel couldn't fully observe because Charlotte had asked him to wait in the outer room, which he did. He sat in a wooden chair and listened to the sounds from behind the closed door and couldn't make out words, only the particular texture of women talking about things that had been carried a long time in private, which had a different sound from other conversation. Clara came out once to refill a glass of water and looked at him with the evaluating directness of someone deciding in real time what to make of him. She was a few years older than Evelyn, with a practical face and the specific kind of steadiness that came from having been through things and come out the other side carrying them differently than when they went in. "You're the one who started this," she said. "Evelyn started it," he said. "I'm paying for it." Clara looked at him for another moment. "She trusts you," she said. "She doesn't trust easily." "I know that," he said. "Then don't make her wrong about it," Clara said, and went back in with the water. He sat in the wooden chair and looked at the wall and thought about what it meant to be trusted by someone who had learned not to be, and what that cost the person doing the trusting, and whether he was actually equal to it, not in the practical sense of the legal fight, which he understood, but in the other sense, the personal one, which he was only beginning to let himself look at directly. When Charlotte finally let him in, she spread the case documentation across her desk and walked all 3 of them through it for 2 hours, and Nathaniel sat in the corner and listened to the shape of what she'd built. It was a strong case. He understood that the way he understood strong contracts, not with certainty, because nothing in law was certain, but with the particular weight of something well constructed. The forged signature on Evelyn's contract, Clara's testimony about Voss's methods, Dorothy Haas's release letter with the corrected debt amount, the pattern of Voss's notary witness appearing on document after document across years and counties. Charlotte had filed in Laramie District Court and been granted the venue change. The hearing was set for August. "August?" Evelyn wrote when Charlotte said the date. She held up the paper. Her expression was asking whether that was good news or bad. "It's good," Charlotte said. "Fast for district court. Voss's lawyer will try to delay, but I've already anticipated his arguments." She looked at Evelyn directly. "You'll need to testify. In person. In the courtroom. Can you do that?" Evelyn put the paper down and picked up her pencil and wrote on a fresh piece. Charlotte took it and read it and looked at him. "What does it say?" he asked. "She says she's been waiting for 2 years to say something to Voss in a room where it counts," Charlotte said. "She says she'll be there." They rode back to the ranch over 2 days, and the country was the same country it had always been, and felt different. Or he felt different moving through it, which was close to the same thing. On the evening of the first day, they camped near a creek where the willows had come fully in and the water was running fast and cold from the mountain snowmelt. He built a fire and she cooked what she'd packed with the same efficiency she did everything, and they ate in the firelight without talking, which was their ordinary mode and which had been, without his fully marking when the change happened, a version of talking all its own. He was watching the fire when she tapped his arm and held out a piece of paper. "Thank you. I know I've said it before. I know you told me not to. I'm saying it again anyway." He looked at the paper and looked at her. She was watching the fire now, giving him the same privacy she always gave him when she said something that mattered. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "August is still ahead of us." She shook her head slightly, not disagreeing with August, disagreeing with the premise. She wrote again, "I mean for this winter, for the barn, the books, for letting me plant the garden, before any of this started." He didn't have an answer to that. He looked at the fire and the creek beyond it and the darkening sky above the willows, and he thought about a woman arriving in the snow in November with nothing except what she could carry and the knowledge of how to survive with it, and the months since, and everything that had been built inside them. Not constructed deliberately, not planned, but grown, the way things grow when the conditions are right and nobody interferes. "You changed things," he said, "in the house, for the better." He paused. I hadn't been paying attention to things for a while, before you came." She looked at him. "You made me pay attention again," he said. "That's not nothing." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked at the fire, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, and the creek ran beside them in the dark, and the stars came out over the mountains one by one. July at the ranch was work. That was the truth of it. There was no month on a working ranch in the territory that wasn't work, but July had a particular quality of density, everything that needed doing before the fall converging at once. The cattle needed moving, the fences needed the last of their summer repairs. The hay needed cutting and storing. Russ was back from Cheyenne with the sale completed at a price that was, as he'd predicted, less generous than it should have been, and the difference sat in Nathaniel's ledger as a number that didn't change the outcome but changed the margin. He worked alongside the hands more that month than he usually did, partly because there was too much to do and not enough bodies to do it, partly because the physical work was the right counterweight to the waiting, which had a different quality than the winter waiting, sharper, more specific, with a defined endpoint that was still 6 weeks away. Evelyn had her own version of the waiting. He could see it in the way she moved through July, the extra focus she brought to the garden and the barn and the medicinal corner, the way she went to bed later and got up earlier. She was a person who handled uncertainty by working, which was something he understood in his bones, and he watched her work and didn't try to slow her down or redirect her, because you didn't redirect something that was managing itself. But one evening, in mid-July, he came back from a late run to check the upper fence line and found her in the study, which was not unusual. She spent evenings there now, reading, and he'd come to think of it as a shared space without anything formal being said about it. What was unusual was that she wasn't reading. She was sitting in the chair by the fire with the surveying journals on the table beside her, and she wasn't looking at them. She was looking at the fire with an expression that was entirely unguarded, and in it he could see clearly the weight of the waiting and the specific fear underneath the weight. Not fear of the courtroom or of Voss's lawyer, but the older fear, the one that had been there since before November. The fear of a person who has been told repeatedly by circumstance that the thing they need is not going to be given to them. He came in and sat down across from her and didn't say anything for a moment. She became aware of him, and the blankness started to come back, the management, the composure. "Don't," he said. She stopped. She looked at him. "You don't have to do that with me," he said. He said it quietly, not as a request, more as a statement of something he should have said explicitly before now. "Not in this room. Not when it's just us." She held very still. "I know you're scared," he said. "That's not a weakness. That's just true." Her face did something complicated, several things at once in the way faces do when a person is managing several true things that contradict each other. Then she reached for her pencil and paper, and she wrote something and held it out. "I'm not scared of losing. I'm scared of being wrong about it mattering." He read it. He looked at her. "It matters," he said. "Whatever happens in August. Clara Sutter is in Casper working in a dry goods store because she got out. Dorothy Haas borrowed money from her brother and paid her way free. You walked out of that place in November and you're here." He looked at her steadily. "The contract they write in August doesn't determine whether it mattered. It already mattered." She looked at him for a long time. Something in her face settled. Not resolved, not fixed, but steadied, the way a compass settles after you move it. She put the paper down. He got up and went to the bookshelves and found the natural history she'd read in January, early in her time at the ranch, and he brought it back and held it out. She took it and looked at the cover and looked at him with a question. "You read it twice already," he said. "Read it again if you want." "I never have." "Tell me what's in it." She looked at him for a moment, surprised or something like it, and then the corner of her mouth moved. It was small, and it was brief, and it was the closest thing to a smile he'd seen from her that wasn't deployed to manage a situation. It was private, involuntary, real. She opened the book. He got his ledger from the desk and sat back down across from her and opened it, and the fire moved between them. And outside the July night was warm, and the cattle were in the upper pastures, and the garden was growing, and August was 6 weeks away. And in the particular quality of the silence between them, which had by now accumulated enough shared history to be its own thing, its own ongoing conversation. In that silence, something that had been growing slowly and without announcement all winter and spring and summer continued to grow patient and specific, in no hurry at all. August came in hot and dry, the way it did in the high country every few years when the summer decided to make its point before giving way to fall. They rode to Laramie on a Tuesday, Nathaniel and Evelyn and Russ, who had insisted on coming without being asked, and whom Nathaniel had not argued with because Russ's presence at things had a stabilizing effect on the proceedings, whatever the proceedings were. They met Charlotte at her office the evening before the hearing, and Charlotte went through everything one final time with the particular focused calm of someone who had been in enough courtrooms to have stopped being afraid of them and had not yet started being complacent about them. Clara Sutter was already there. She'd come down from Casper by stage, and she looked tired from the travel but steady in herself. And she and Evelyn sat beside each other on the bench outside Charlotte's inner office and communicated in the way they apparently had developed between them. Evelyn writing, Clara talking, both of them understanding each other with the ease of people who had been through the same rooms and knew what the rooms smelled like. Dorothy Haas arrived an hour later, a compact woman in her 30s with the specific kind of matter-of-fact manner that Nathaniel associated with people who had solved hard problems without much help and had adjusted their expectations of the world accordingly. She shook his hand when Charlotte introduced them and looked at him the way Clara had looked at him in Charlotte's office in June, assessing, direct, not hostile, but not deferential either. "You're the one paying for this," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why?" "Because it's right," he said, which was the same thing he'd told Charlotte months ago, and which was still true, and still insufficient, and which he'd stopped trying to expand upon, because the expansion always led somewhere more personal than the question was usually asking. Dorothy looked at him for another moment and then nodded once, as if she'd gotten what she needed from that, and went to sit with Evelyn and Clara. Charlotte appeared in the doorway. "Get some sleep," she said. "All of you. Tomorrow is long." Whoop. The Laramie District Courthouse was a stone building that took itself seriously, which Nathaniel had always thought was the right quality for a courthouse to have. They arrived early, Charlotte's instruction, and sat in the hallway on the hard wooden benches while the building filled around them. Voss arrived with Pruitt and 2 other men Nathaniel didn't recognize. Voss looked, if anything, more confident than he had at the ranch gate in April. The confidence of a man on his home ground, doing a thing he'd done before and won. He looked at Nathaniel across the hallway with the expression of someone who has moved past personal feeling and arrived at pure calculation. Nathaniel looked back at him without expression. Evelyn was sitting to his left. She was looking at the floor, not because she was afraid of Voss, he understood that now, but because she was saving it. She was managing herself for the moment when it would count, holding the composure in reserve, which was different from hiding behind it. He put his hand on the bench between them, not touching her, just there. She looked at it. Then she put her hand next to his, also not touching, also just there. They sat that way until Charlotte came to tell them it was time. And the hearing lasted 2 days. The first day was Pruitt's, in the sense that he controlled the pace of it, methodical, thorough, presenting the contract documentation with the practiced fluency of someone who had done exactly this in front of exactly this kind of judge before. He established the debt, the signature, the notarization, the filing. He called Voss's notary witness, a man named Elias Cole, who testified with the rehearsed calm of someone who had been testifying for years and had learned to sound reasonable while saying very little. Pruitt built his case like a man laying stone, each piece fitted against the next, the whole thing solid and deliberate and, on its surface, convincing. Charlotte did not interrupt unnecessarily. She made her objections precisely, on points that mattered, and let the rest go. Nathaniel sat behind the bar and watched her and understood what she was doing. She was letting Pruitt finish his structure so she could demonstrate exactly where the foundation was hollow. Evelyn sat beside him through the first day without writing anything, without communicating anything, watching the proceedings with a focused stillness that he recognized as the same quality she brought to the barn at night with the horses. Total attention, no performance of reaction. That evening in the hotel dining room she wrote, "Tomorrow." "Yes," he said. She wrote, "I've been waiting 2 years to say what I'm going to say tomorrow. I just want you to know that, whatever happens." "I know," he said. She looked at him, and then she did something she hadn't done before in the months he'd known her. She reached across the table and put her hand over his for a moment. Brief, deliberate, the way she did everything, and then she took it back and picked up her fork and went back to her food. And he sat there for a moment with the specific warmth of it still on his hand and looked at his plate and thought that some things didn't need to be examined carefully to be understood. Okay. Charlotte opened the second day by calling Dorothy Haas. Dorothy testified for 40 minutes in the way she did everything, direct, specific, without embellishment. She described the debt, the contract, the 3 years of work. She produced the release letter and Charlotte walked her through its contents, specifically the accounting that showed the reduced debt amount, and specifically the fact that this reduced amount was identical to the original loan amount that Dorothy's father had actually borrowed, and which was $230 less than the contract stated. Pruitt's cross-examination was capable and showed all the right moves. He questioned her memory, questioned the provenance of the letter, suggested the accounting was the result of a negotiated reduction rather than a correction of the original figure. Dorothy answered everything without losing her composure, and the key thing, the thing Nathaniel could see the judge noting, was that her answers didn't change when Pruitt pushed at them, because they were true, and true things don't shift under pressure the way constructed things do. Then Charlotte called Clara Sutter. Clara had a different quality on the stand than Dorothy, less contained, more direct, the kind of witness who looks at the person questioning them instead of at the middle distance, which juries and judges tend to find either compelling or alarming. In this instance, given what she was describing, it was compelling. She talked about arriving at Voss's household at 22. She talked about the document she'd signed and the conditions she'd signed it under, and the specific discrepancy between what she'd been told the debt was and what the contract said. She talked about trying to leave in her second year and being brought back by 2 men Voss employed for that purpose. She described this last part with a flatness that was more disturbing than any display of emotion would have been. When Pruitt tried to characterize her return as a lawful enforcement of a valid contract, Clara looked at him for a moment and said, "2 men came to where I was staying in the night and put me in a wagon. I don't know what you call that in your office, but I can tell you what it felt like." The judge wrote something down. Charlotte called Evelyn last. She took the stand in the particular way she did things, quietly, without hesitation, with the economy of someone who does not waste motion. The courtroom had a specific silence in it as she settled. Nathaniel had noticed this, the way her silence changed the texture of the space around her, the way people in her presence stopped generating noise and waited, not because she commanded it, but because there was something in her quality of attention that invited the same. Charlotte had prepared for her testimony carefully. Evelyn would write her answers on paper and Charlotte would read them aloud, which the judge had approved. Evelyn had submitted an affidavit explaining that her silence was the result of sustained trauma, and was involuntary, and the judge had accepted this without comment. Charlotte stood near the stand with a clear view of what Evelyn wrote, and the court reporter noted what Charlotte read. The testimony took an hour. Charlotte walked her through the history methodically, the debt, the contract, the signature. When they reached the signature, Charlotte asked her to write her name on a piece of paper in her ordinary way and then placed Voss's contract beside it for the judge to see. The difference was apparent to anyone in the room. Charlotte had also, over the preceding weeks, located 2 letters Evelyn had written to her father in the year before he died. Legitimate personal letters, preserved by a neighbor who'd kept them without knowing their significance. And those signatures, in the same careful, deliberate hand, matched the courtroom signature, and neither matched the contract. Pruitt objected to the letters. The judge overruled him. Charlotte then asked Evelyn about the 3rd year of her time at Voss's, specifically about Clara's attempted departure and return. Evelyn wrote, and Charlotte read, "I watched them bring her back. I was told that this was what happened to people who left before the contract was complete. I was told it had happened before." Charlotte asked, "What did you understand from that?" Evelyn wrote for a moment, and Charlotte read what she'd written without inflection, which was the right choice because the words were sufficient on their own. "I understood that I was not an employee. I understood that I had no right to leave. I understood that the debt on the contract was not something I could ever fully pay because the number on the contract was not the real number. I stayed 2 more years because I was afraid, and then I stopped being afraid, and I left." The room was quiet. Charlotte asked, "Why did you stop being afraid?" Evelyn wrote. Charlotte read, "Because he brought in a 17-year-old girl with her father's signature on a document she'd never read. And I understood that being afraid was just another way of letting it continue." Pruitt's cross-examination of Evelyn was the most revealing thing in the 2 days of proceedings, though not in the way he intended. He tried the same approaches he'd used on Dorothy and Clara, questioning memory, suggesting alternative interpretations, implying that the details didn't hold together. Evelyn answered each question in writing with a precision that was, if anything, more damaging in written form than speech, because each answer sat on the paper complete and exact and without the ambiguities that speech sometimes introduced. When Pruitt pushed, her answers got shorter and more specific, not longer and more complicated, and Nathaniel watched the judge reading those answers and understood, from the quality of attention on the judge's face, which direction this was going. Pruitt asked finally whether Evelyn had any evidence beyond her own account that the signature on the contract was not hers. Charlotte stood. "Your Honor, we've already entered the comparative signature evidence, but Ms. Hart would like to respond directly." The judge nodded. Evelyn wrote for a moment. Charlotte read, "The signature on the contract was made by a man who held my hand and guided it while I was told to be still. His name is Elias Cole. He testified in this room yesterday. He has done this before. He will do it again unless this court says otherwise. Elias Cole, in the gallery, did something with his face that several people in the room noticed and that Nathaniel stored away without expression." The judge took 1 day to deliberate. Nathaniel had expected longer, and the brevity told him something before the verdict was announced. They gathered in the courtroom the following afternoon, all of them, Nathaniel and Charlotte and Evelyn and Clara and Dorothy, and Russ in the back row with his hat on his knee. And the judge came in and sat down and looked at his papers for a moment before he looked up. He voided the contract. Insufficient evidence of valid execution, he said, which was the legal way of saying the signature was forged. He found the pattern of Elias Cole's witness appearances across multiple contracts relevant and referred the matter to the Territorial Attorney General's office for further investigation. He ordered Voss's operation to produce its full contract records within 60 days for review. He did not arrest Voss. He did not make any finding of criminal liability. The law moved slowly, and the judge worked within what the law gave him, which was not everything and was not nothing. Voss left the courtroom without looking at any of them. Nathaniel watched him go. He didn't feel what he might have expected to feel, triumph or relief or any of the cleaner emotions. What he felt was more complicated than that, a kind of heaviness that was different from loss, the specific weight of understanding that the man walking out had done this for years and would likely find ways to continue doing it, and that what the court had accomplished today was real and partial and the beginning of something rather than the end. But it was the beginning of something. That was real too. He looked at Evelyn. She was looking at the place where Voss had been standing, and then she looked at the contract on the table, voided now, marked with the judge's notation. And then she looked at Nathaniel. Her expression was not triumph either. It was something quieter. The expression of someone who has been carrying a specific weight for a specific number of years and has just set it down, and is still standing, and is figuring out what it feels like to stand without it. He held her gaze. She reached for her paper and pencil and wrote one line and held it up. "It's done." "It's done," he said. Clara, beside her, put a hand on her shoulder briefly and then took it away, the compact gesture of someone who understood that the moment was Evelyn's to have privately. Dorothy was already talking to Charlotte about the Attorney General's investigation, asking practical questions in her practical way, and Charlotte was answering them with the same attention she'd brought to everything, and Russ was standing in the back row looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has just witnessed something that exceeded his expectations and is handling it by looking at the ceiling. Nathaniel looked at all of them. These people assembled in this room by the particular chain of consequence that had started with a bell at a gate in November, and he felt something that he recognized but hadn't had much occasion to feel in the preceding 4 years. Something that was, simply and without drama, gratitude. For the specific people in the room, for the fact of the room, for the winter that had made it necessary. They rode home over 3 days instead of 2, which was Nathaniel's suggestion and which nobody argued with. On the second evening, they camped again near the creek with the willows, the same place they'd stopped on the way to Laramie 6 weeks before. And the willows had dried somewhat in the August heat, and the creek was lower but still running. Russ made himself useful with the fire and then took his bedroll to a discreet distance and read by lamplight, which was his way of giving them space without making anything of it. They sat by the fire in their ordinary silence, but the silence had a different quality tonight. Lighter, less loaded, the way air feels after a long rain when the pressure is finally broken. She was sitting closer to the fire than usual, her knees drawn up, and she was looking into it with an expression that was open in the way she only let herself be when she thought no one was paying attention. He was paying attention. After a while, she picked up her pencil and paper and wrote something and held it toward him without looking away from the fire. What happens now? He looked at the question and sat with it. It was the question he'd been thinking about since the courthouse, in the way you think about something that you've been avoiding thinking about directly because the direct version of the thought was more significant than you were ready for. "You're free," he said. "Whatever you want to do. Charlotte says the Attorney General's investigation may need your testimony again, but that's months away and not certain." He looked at the fire. "You could go anywhere, start anywhere." She wrote, "Is that what you want?" He looked at the question on the paper and understood that it was not actually asking about what he wanted her to do. It was asking something more specific and more personal than that, and she knew the difference, and she was asking it anyway, which was itself significant. This woman who had spent years learning not to ask for things. "No," he said, "that's not what I want." She looked at the fire. "What I want," he said, and then he stopped and started again because he was not a man who found these particular words easy, and he'd spent 4 years being out of practice with them, and he believed she deserved accuracy more than she deserved fluency. "What I want is for you to stay because you choose to, not because you have nowhere else to go. You have somewhere else to go now. You could go anywhere, but because you choose the ranch, because you choose—" He stopped again. She was looking at him now. "Because you choose it," he said, which was incomplete, and she knew it, and he looked at her and finished it honestly. "Because you choose me." The fire moved between them. The creek ran in the dark beyond the willows. Somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called once and then was quiet. She picked up her paper and wrote for longer than usual, and when she held it out, her hand was not entirely steady. "I chose this the night you told me I didn't owe you anything. I didn't know what I was choosing yet. I know now." "Yes." He read it twice. He looked at her. "I'm not an easy person," he said, which felt necessary and true. She raised her eyebrows in an expression that said this was not new information and was not a problem. "I'm going to get it wrong sometimes," he said. "I got it wrong for 4 years being closed off from everything, and I'm still working out how to be different." She wrote, "You've been different since November. You just didn't tell yourself yet." He sat with that for a moment and found it was accurate. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat by the fire while Russ read his book at a distance, and the creek ran and the August stars came out over the mountains, and he held the hand of a woman who had walked out of a bad place in November with nothing and had made herself indispensable to his life in the specific, unhurried way that real things grow. And he thought about all the things he'd built over 20 years, the land, the cattle, the contracts, the reputation, and how none of it had felt, in quite some time, as solid as this. Fall came to the Cross Ranch the way it always came. The light changing first, going gold and long in the afternoons, and then the first cold mornings, and then the first real frost that took the remaining summer flowers in the kitchen garden overnight and left them translucent and flattened in the dawn. Evelyn stood at the garden fence the morning after the first frost and looked at what the cold had done, and Nathaniel stood beside her with coffee, and neither of them said anything about it. She'd already been saving seeds for 3 weeks. He'd watched her do it, the small envelopes she made from folded paper, each one labeled in her careful handwriting, arranged in a wooden box she'd asked Pete to make for her. Everything that had grown this summer was going into the ground again next spring in those envelopes. Nothing that was real was lost, even when the frost came. The ranch was different now, in ways that were both visible and not. Clara Sutter had visited in September, and the visit had stretched from 3 days to 10 without anyone remarking on it. And when she finally went back to Casper, she left with the address of the Attorney General's office and a list of names Charlotte had compiled of other women who might be in similar situations and hadn't come forward yet. The investigation into Voss's operation had been confirmed and was ongoing. Elias Cole, Nathaniel had heard through Charlotte, had hired his own lawyer, which was the specific behavior of a man who understood he had a problem. Voss himself had gone quiet. Whether he was preparing another challenge or had decided to cut his losses, Nathaniel didn't know, and Charlotte didn't know yet either. Some men, when their structure started to be examined, shored it up. Others dismantled what they could and moved on. He didn't know yet which kind Voss was. He was prepared for either, but that was the work still ahead. What was present right now in the gold morning light with the frost on the garden was the specific life that had assembled itself around this place over the past year. Not as he'd planned it, not as he could have predicted it, but real and his, and shared. Russ came out of the barn and looked at the frost damage and shook his head with the resignation of a man who has seen frost damage every fall of his adult life. Pete was working near the fence and said something to Evelyn about the state of the comfrey, and she turned and gave him the look she reserved for his horticultural opinions, which he'd learned to expect and which he still couldn't help provoking. The bay gelding, the one whose leg had healed clean in the winter, the one she'd sat with in the barn in the dark, moved in the paddock with the easy soundness of a horse that had no memory of being otherwise. Nathaniel drank his coffee and watched his yard. He'd been thinking, lately, about something that seemed simple and wasn't, about the difference between a life that was built and a life that was grown. He'd spent 20 years building, deliberately, systematically, with clear goals and the resources to pursue them. He'd built the ranch and the reputation and the financial position and the careful isolation he'd mistaken for peace. He was good at building. Most men he respected were good at building. It was what the frontier asked of you and what it rewarded. But the things that had mattered most in the past 12 months had not been built. They had grown, the way the kitchen garden had grown, put in the ground with attention, and then left to do what living things do when the conditions are right. The trust between himself and Evelyn, developing through winter silences and barn evenings, and conversations she'd had with him in writing that contained more honesty than most conversations he'd had in his life. The way the ranch had become, without anyone declaring it, a place that people came to when they needed steadiness. Clara's 10-day visit. The hands who'd started going to Evelyn with things. Russ, who had always been reliable and was now something more than that, who had driven 3 hours to Cheyenne to sell cattle at a bad price and come back without complaint, and who had sat in the back row of a courtroom and looked at the ceiling so nobody had to watch him be moved. You couldn't build loyalty like that. You could only be the kind of place where it grew. Evelyn turned from the garden fence and looked at him. She had the question in her face that wasn't quite a question. She did this sometimes, presented a look that meant, "What are you thinking about?" without demanding an answer. "The summer cabin," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "Ellen wanted to build a summer cabin in the high country," he said. "I was thinking about it the other day. There's a ridge up there, maybe 2 hours on horseback, that looks east over the whole valley. She used to talk about sitting up there in the morning." He looked at Evelyn. "I thought maybe next summer, if you wanted to see it." She held his eyes for a moment, understanding, he thought, everything he was saying and also what he wasn't saying, that suggesting this was not forgetting Ellen, was not replacing her. Was something different from both of those things? Was the specific act of a man learning to let the past be complete without letting it be the only thing? She nodded. She turned back to the garden, and after a moment she reached into her apron pocket and came out with one of the small seed envelopes and held it out toward him. He took it. Her careful handwriting on the outside said plantain. The things she'd gone out in January to find under the snow. The things she'd put in the medicinal corner all spring. The things she was already planning to grow again. He held the envelope and understood that this was what she was telling him. That you put things in the ground even in winter. That you went looking for what you needed even when the snow covered it. That what had been alive before the frost could come up again if someone saved the seeds and kept them safe until the ground was ready. He put the envelope in his coat pocket. The morning moved on around them. The frost beginning to melt where the sun hit it, the yard coming to life, the ordinary, irreplaceable noise of a working place on a fall morning. None of it was simple, and none of it was finished, and all of it was, in the specific way of things that are true, enough. There is a version of the story that ends with the courtroom, with the judge's ruling and the voided contract, and Voss walking out into the Laramie Street. And that ending is real. It happened. It mattered. It was the thing that needed doing, and they did it. But the story that is actually worth telling is longer than that and quieter. It's the story of a man who had everything a man was supposed to want, and had forgotten that wanting was something you did with the part of yourself you couldn't put in a ledger. It's the story of a woman who survived by being invisible and discovered, slowly and without fanfare, that she no longer needed to be. It's the story of what happens when two people who have both learned the hard way to ask for nothing are placed by circumstance in proximity and given enough time and enough winter and enough shared silence to learn, painstakingly, to ask for something. The lesson, if there is one, is not about courage or sacrifice, though there was both. It's something simpler and harder to say without sounding like you're reducing it. That the things worth having in a life are not the things you acquire, but the things you grow toward. And that growing toward something requires you to be honest about what you actually need, which is often the last thing you let yourself admit. Nathaniel Cross had been an honest man his whole adult life about every kind of business, and almost no kind of personal truth. He'd needed someone who communicated in something other than words to teach him that honesty in the ledger and honesty in the chest were not the same skill, and that the second one was harder, and that it was the one that determined everything. Evelyn Hart had been made to disappear, to take up no space, to owe everything and own nothing. She'd needed a place that was solid enough to push back against, a place where her presence accumulated over time into something that couldn't be dismissed or erased, a place where the ground was hers to plant in. She'd found it, as most real things are found, not by looking, but by walking out of something false and being, eventually, in the right place. The seed envelope in Nathaniel's pocket was a small thing. The garden behind them was full of small things, each one chosen and tended and allowed to become what it was. That was enough. That was, in the end, all of it.